My message to unvaccinated Americans is this. What more is there to wait for? What more do you need to see? We've been patient, but our patience is wearing thin.
That was, of course, President Joe Biden announcing a significant expansion of the federal vaccine mandates earlier this week. Welcome to the Real Clear Politics Takeaway for Friday, September 10th. I'm Andrew Walworth. Well, so on Thursday, President Biden signed an executive order requiring COVID-19 vaccination for all federal employees. He instructed the Labor Department to develop rules that would force private businesses with more than 100 employees to make full vaccination or weekly testing compulsory. And he said he plans to mandate vaccines for those working in hospitals or other medical facilities that treat Medicare and Medicaid patients. It's a big expansion of federal power. Some say it's unconstitutional, and it sets up a fight with those Republican governors who oppose mandates, some of whom have already pledged to defy the new federal rules. Also this week, the Democrats are counting down the days until September 27th. That's the self-imposed deadline for a vote on the president's, quote, Build Back Better bill. It's a spending package with an unknowable price tag, festooned with all sorts of new entitlements. With a slim majority in the House and a 50-50 divide in the Senate, every vote is critical. Is compromise possible? And what happens if the strategic pause, advocated by Senator Joe Manchin last week, lasts throughout the fall? And Saturday marks the 20th anniversary of 9/11. We'll talk about the meaning of this date and how America has changed in the 2 decades since the fall of the Twin Towers, the crash at the Pentagon, and the downing of Flight 93. Joining me to talk about all this are Tom Bevan, RealClearPolitics co-founder and president, Carl Cannon, Washington bureau chief, and AB Stoddard, associate editor and columnist. So, Tom, let's start with the president's Thursday speech. Phil Wegman has a good piece in today's RCP. He points out that this move towards vaccine mandates, as opposed to a mix of voluntary vaccines and testing, is a change in direction for the president. Is this a good idea? What are the politics of it? How did the president do?
I don't think it was a good idea. I think that Biden has sort of needlessly inflamed folks. I think it's going to have the opposite effect that he wants. It'll probably, the folks who are resistant to taking the vaccine will most likely be even more resistant. He could have sat with these governors and said, hey, we need to get more people in your states vaccinated. How can we go about doing that? How can we work together? What can we do? Instead, he basically came out last night and said, I'm going to use the power of my office to move them out of the way. Those were his words. And so he is in direct confrontation. I know Democrats and liberals loved it and cheered him on and thought it was wonderful that he's getting tough with the unvaxxed. But by the way, Biden was opposed to vaccine mandates not so long ago. Kamala Harris yesterday, talking about the Texas abortion law, said when people are able to make choices without government interference for themselves in terms of their well-being and the well-being of their family in consultation with whoever they may choose, we are a stronger society. That was Kamala Harris yesterday on the same day that...
But not the same topic.
But a different topic, exactly. But so look, I think there are a lot of contradictions here. I do think it is going to invite all sorts of legal challenges, and it just basically took this battle and blew it up writ large across the country in a way. And I don't know, quite frankly, I don't know if that's good for Democrats or bad for Democrats as far as the politics of this are concerned. I have to see how that plays out over time.
Carl, what do you think?
Joe Biden expressed exasperation yesterday at why people, Americans, adults who won't get the coronavirus vaccine. It's an exasperation I share. But unlike Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, I didn't denigrate the vaccine last year the way they did when they were running for president, the way Andrew Cuomo did when he was governor of New York, and other Democrats, other progressives, called it the Trump vaccine. Cuomo said when it first came out that he was going to encourage other governors not to administer it. Why am I bringing that up now? Because President Biden wants to make this like these are Trumpies who won't take the vaccine. But the Kaiser Foundation had a poll and it showed that, Republicans are less likely to get this vaccine than Democrats, but 58% of evangelical Christians haven't taken the vaccine. 60% of African Americans, and that's 58% of white evangelical Christians, 60%. So not much difference. So what I wish, and I wish this for Donald Trump when he was president, this idea of demonizing people doesn't work. And it has a way of boomeranging. This guy had to look in the mirror, because when Americans were making up their mind about this vaccine, including a lot of his voters, including African Americans and Latinos, he wasn't so hot on it. Now, that was a long time ago. It was 9 months ago, but still, he had a role in this reluctance of the vaccine that he's never acknowledged.
Well, AB, we do have FDA approval of the vaccine now. 90% of people in schools, according to the president, administrators and teachers are vaccinated. 70% of the country. Tom mentioned this, what he said about the Republican governors. He compared them to school bullies. And he said, quote, "If these governors won't help us beat the pandemic, I'll use my power as president to get them out of the way." Pretty harsh words from a president. What do you think?
Let's just start with the court challenges about being unconstitutional. And of course, just like Tom's quote from Kamala Harris, Democrats are jumping up and down about Governor Abbott of Texas using the words right to choose in his pushback to the announcements from the executive branch yesterday. So hypocrisy is bipartisan, as we know. I don't know what the courts are going to decide on this, so let's just leave that aside. The president has been urged by members of his party to stick with his mandate, which was to tackle and contain COVID as best he could, as the number one mission of his presidency, and that everything else was secondary. I've been saying in our discussions that getting away from that was his biggest problem. It's why independents began to leave him in polling before the Afghanistan withdrawal. COVID is everything. If he gets that wrong, nothing else matters. When they were enjoying good polling, they were afraid of the political response to leaning into mandates and this kind of exasperation. Now he has nothing left to lose. He literally has to turn this around or nothing else matters. And so if you combine the popularity of mandates in polling, the fact that the vaccinated are now the strong majority, we have 75% of the country has had one shot. Republicans are vaccinated. Republicans like mandates. If you look at the polling, there's no pushback from business because business largely wants the political cover to mandate. We know from polling and focus groups that the thing that pushes people to get vaccinated more than anything is their employer, their job. This is going to raise the rate of vaccination. And there's also, in terms back to the Democrats, there is polling that I've been briefed about on background. There's polling that shows that the democracy stuff, the January 6th stuff, that doesn't really move voters. But what is starting to move sort of Biden Republicans and independents is the Republicans' kind of COVID radicalism. And that's why the White House has made the decision to lean into this, because there is palpable frustration about the policies of Governor Abbott and of Governor DeSantis. I know I mentioned this, I think, last time. Governor DeSantis's polling, his internal polling, I'm told on background, is worse than his public polling, which is plummeting. So their policies are not popular in their own states. So Biden feels permission from his party to lean into this because A, he has no choice, but B, it's likely that Republicans will pay for their COVID extremism.
Tom, what do you think?
The idea that Joe Biden, his speech was so full of contradictions, right? He stands up there and says, look, the vaccines work, people, they work. And, so everybody needs to get them. But I'm going to take all of these extraordinary measures, extreme measures, some would say, right, in order to protect the vaccinated from the unvaccinated. That makes no sense. If you're vaccinated and you're protected, okay, then you shouldn't have anything to worry about from the unvaccinated. Now, you could argue, right, as AB has argued and Carl has argued, well, the problem with the unvaccinated is they're clogging up the hospitals and you can't go get a mammogram or something, right, because they're taken up, or if someone has a cancer or whatever. That's a different argument than the argument he was making last night. Another point that he did not address last night at all and has not spoken about is natural immunity, right? I have a 22-year-old son who's had COVID. Studies show that he is 12 to 27 times less vulnerable than if he had taken the vaccine, okay? He has more protection, 12 to 27 times more protection than he would have if he had taken the mRNA vaccine. He's perfectly healthy. has, he's fit, he exercises, all that stuff. Does he need to get the vaccine? Is the government going to mandate that he has to get the vaccine? Is the government going to force his employer to mandate that he get the vaccine? Biden doesn't want to touch that because I don't think he can necessarily answer that in a reasonable way. And that's one of the objections that has sort of gone unanswered throughout this entire process, this entire debate about vaccines or not. What if you've had COVID? What if you have natural immunity? What rights does that allow you in terms of the greater good and the public health and all these things that people are talking about? So I just thought the speech was full of contradictions, and I don't think it's going to have the intended effect that he wants. It may, in fact, have the opposite effect. We've been bifurcated along lines of vaccinated and unvaccinated. Many of the vaccinated, particularly in the policymaking elite media aspect of our society, look down at the unvaxxed as like these, horrible, unwashed, MAGA rubes that are gobbling horse goo, as Jimmy Kimmel would say, and don't deserve, treatment or respect or anything other than derision and mockery. And I think that's a bad place to take the country.
Well, Carl, I think we mentioned
Carl was shaking his head while I was talking. So let's go, Carl.
I know.
Have at it.
Well, you were going to ask me a question.
I was going to ask you.
You ignore it.
My question
was,
for
those of you who this is audio only, so our listeners cannot see Carl biting his tongue right now.
Carl, I will forego my question and allow you a rebuttal and response.
Well, no, I don't really disagree. I just don't think. I don't think pitting Americans against each other is the right way to go. It's the opposite of what Joe Biden promised. I mean, extensively. And he made a convincing argument, and I believed him. I also think his frustration is real. I mean, AB was talking about Governor DeSantis and these Republicans who supposedly believe in local control and decentralized government. So in Tallahassee, they're telling school boards they can't require masks in school. They'll be fined if they do. Florida's passing laws saying employers can't require employees to wear masks. If you want to talk about the authoritarianness, I mean, Biden's the president, but he didn't start this. I mean, these heavy-handed tactics were started by these Republican governors in opposition to mask mandates. I think Tom's point about the unvaccinated,
well, hold on, Carl.
who've had COVID is right, though. Why to have a federal government require millions of people to get vaccines and to threaten them if they don't, and to basically call them names, doesn't take into account the vagaries of people's health situation. Not everybody's like a Robert F. Kennedy anti-vaxxer. People have reasons. And if you've had this and you've gotten over it and you have antibodies, to have Washington tell you have to get a vaccine, it's just heavy-handed. It is. But I do think the president's frustration is genuine.
Well, AB,
can I just say real quickly?
It's not a rebuttal.
This is going to be a 3-hour podcast.
No.
There's some other
I want
word
to point.
for
Look, I do think, as AB pointed out, there is hypocrisy to go all the way around, right? And whenever the shoe is on the other foot, Republicans and Democrats are guilty of that. To say that the heavy-handed tactics started with Republicans who were mandating. I mean, I think we could go back to the beginning of this pandemic and some of the heavy-handed tactics that were used in shutting down the economy and the lockdowns that were primarily in blue states, among blue state governors. And you had red state governors that went the opposite direction, that were trying to, basically keep things open and protect people's freedoms and whatnot. And we're in a different place now, obviously, but I'm not sure I agree with the statement that the Republican governors were the ones who started the heavy-handed tactics, even if they may be at some level employing them now.
Maybe I want to move on in a second, but I just got to get your thought on this question, which is, you've said, and I think you might be right, that solving COVID is everything. Without solving COVID, there's real disasters ahead for the Democrats and for Biden. So in your mind, what constitutes success on COVID? Because I think that's part of the objection here, is that the goal line keeps moving. What, in your mind, would Joe Biden be able to stand up and say, yes, we've done it, COVID's under control, we can go back to a more normal America?
what's in my mind doesn't matter. And notice I didn't comment on whether or not the speech was successful. I was describing why they felt pushed to do this and why they believe they have the polling behind them to be on safe enough ground. They have lost the unvaccinated politically. They are speaking to people encouraging mandates because it will raise the rate of vaccination. And ultimately, those numbers are changing. People are changing their minds. We're seeing an increase in vaccination this summer, and that will ultimately make the pandemic better. It will lighten the load at hospitals. It will cause fewer deaths. It will reduce infection. We're at more than 150,000 new infections a day now, and 1,500 people dying a 9/11 every 48 hours. So there's, by any metric, less is better. So there's no magic finishing line if we have continued spread and the unvaccinated replicating the virus, which then mutates the virus, which then creates new variants, which then requires new vaccines. There's no end line here. He's talking about bringing it under control because at the start of the summer, when we were all vaccinated and the rates were low, people had high hopes that things were turning around, that the economy would improve, their kids' education would improve, hospitals would be available to them for having a heart attack, and that people would be hiring and all would be much, much better. It's in the polling that we see that President Biden is suffering on his COVID response. Why? Because the Delta variant surged midsummer and now it's out of control again. So he is suffering politically and Ron DeSantis is suffering politically. It's just for different reasons. Now, I don't have like a distinct ending for this. I'm telling you, he's not going to win over people who are going to get more angry as a result of last night's speech. But guess what? A few of the unvaccinated have changed their minds in the last 8 weeks and gotten the shot. And guess who that helps? All of us. Because people have children who are unvaccinated who could get exposed. And again, the hospitals, this is an untenable situation and it cannot get worse. And so he has nothing politically left to lose. And that is backed up by polling.
Andy, can I add one thing to that?
Sure.
You asked what success would look like. What it doesn't look like is where we are now, which is 100,000 people in the country hospitalized for COVID and 1,500 a day dying. That is not success. And we've talked about this for over a year. We know what sex will look like when the death rate really goes down to a manageable number, a number that just doesn't shock us. We're going to talk about 9/11 later in this show. We had 3,000 people die. And well, that's a 2-day total of COVID. So we're not there yet. And I do think we need to keep that in perspective.
Well, I want to turn to the Democrats on Capitol Hill. They did release the first text of this $3.5 trillion bill. We hope to get it through the Senate on reconciliation. So, AB, what is going on? How likely is it that they'll be able to get this done?
I think that the strategy is becoming clear that they gave Bernie Sanders, who's the budget chairman, the administration in the White House team gave the progressives a very long runway to assuage them as long as possible and to allow Bernie Sanders to run this legislative train down the track. And he defiantly said 2 weeks ago that he had wanted 6 to 10 trillion and he has negotiated. His negotiations are over. 3.5 trillion was the rock bottom amount that he would go, and it was already too small. And then, of course, you see Joe Manchin had to pipe up again. First he asked for a pause because of inflation. Now he's giving a top line number of 1.5, and the progressives are freaking out. You need only to read the comments of Jim Clyburn to know where kind of the establishment is. Jim Clyburn is the de facto vice president. He knows more about Biden's thinking and the machinations there than Nancy Pelosi does. He's concerned about the progressives' goals on Medicare. He's talking about Medicaid and ACA subsidies. And this is a division between the leadership that wants to shore up the ACA through longer term or permanent subsidies versus the progressives' goals to expand Medicare with freebies that won't last long enough or discounts that won't last long enough. So just for the listeners to understand, a universal benefit lasts longer or is permanent. and they appeal to more people. Targeted benefits, targeted relief, which is what the progressives are pushing for, are specific, discrete things that they're only trying to fund for a few years so they can fit it in a package and tell America, we've given you literally everything, not a kitchen sink, 12 kitchen sinks. So the moderate Democrats are saying, wait a minute, this is going to boomerang. People are going to lose their benefits and be unhappy. You're basically deceiving them by trying to wedge it all into this price tag. We need, in swing districts, to sell this, we need to provide universal benefits that are properly funded. And they resist this Medicare expansion because that the progressives are pushing for, because they don't think it can meet the fiscal limits. For Clyburn to come out and say these things and then say 3.5 was a ceiling, like we could do it at 1.5 maybe if we can accomplish anything, is all you need to know about their reality, which is that Joe Manchin's going to write this bill in the end, or he's going to be the decider, because they have to get it through. Then they'll tell everyone, that it's great, but they have to support whatever they can get across the finish line with Joe Manchin's help. And that's where the rubber's going to meet the road. He helped write a bill on physical infrastructure, transportation projects that 19 Republican senators supported. And the White House cannot, in their political position, let the progressives tank that. So you're going to see a lot of fighting and a lot of squawking. But I think in the end, they're going to pass something that includes the physical infrastructure and the, quote, human infrastructure that is smaller than 3.5 and doesn't get all of Bernie's items in it.
Well, time is running out here, Tom. And your friend Joe Scarborough, he insists that Democrats have to pass something, and it has to be enormous. This is what he said on September 7th. He said, compromise has to be found. They have no other choice. They have to make history. Or, of course, there will be no justification for them to run for re-election. Do they die on this hill?
They might. The differences between the parties,
the wings of the party, right?
Is real. I tend to agree with AB's analysis because it seems like the most rational thing, that Democrats would be wise to put through a bipartisan infrastructure bill, of which she mentioned 19 Republicans voted for, to put that through the House, and also to try and put through a budget and spending bill that can make its way through the Senate, and with Joe Manchin's support, because it's not going to pass the Senate. Republicans are not going to vote for this. So that would seem like the rational political thing to do. You take the wins, you put them in your pocket, you go to voters and say, look what we did. Because a lot of this stuff is pretty widely popular, if you believe the polling, at least certain aspects of it. And there are a lot of Democrats that I think Democrats are still probably going to lose the House based on history and whatnot, but they'd have a fighting chance if they gave some of their members in some of these swing districts this to be able to take home. I mean, if it blows up, which it could, and I don't know what the odds are of this, it's, maybe 30%, might be as high as 50%. Some people think it's, 10% that they're never going to blow this up. But if they do that for some reason and they get nothing, literally nothing, it's going to be a serious disaster for them. And oh, by the way, Nancy Pelosi is sticking to her timeline of they're going to vote for this on the 27th of September. And they have a continuing resolution that they have to put through, right? Emergency spending, which includes now $6.5 billion for 100,000 Afghan refugees to resettle them in the United States. Oh, and by the way, they also have to pass a debt ceiling increase, which Nancy Pelosi said they won't do without Republican votes. And I'm not sure what the appetite's going to be among Republicans for just, giving them a debt ceiling increase. So there's a lot going on here, and it's all happening in the next 3 weeks, basically 2 or 3 weeks. And so this is crunch time. I mean, they don't have a lot of time to get this done.
Carl, you got a bet on this. How are you feeling about your bet?
Well, I probably should recuse myself from commenting, but then again, Tom would have to do it too, and only AB could talk about it.
Wait, what's Carl's wager? What is this bet?
It's 2 bottles of fine wine. I say there will be an infrastructure bill. Tom said there wouldn't.
AB, you can get in on this if you want.
Wait, a combined both infrastructures?
Anything. Tom was really feeling his oats. Any kind of infrastructure bill.
We made this bet 6 months ago. AB.
I win the bet, AB. If it's
amend?
If it's 1 trillion over, if it's 1 trillion over 30 years for bridges and roads only, I still win the bet. So
okay,
yeah. So I'm Joe Manchin and I are like this.
He's going to get you that wine, Carl Cannon.
Anyway,
well, what Carl doesn't know is I consider Boone's Farm to be a fine wine.
What our audience doesn't know is that if Tom buys me wine, he will end up drinking half of it. Listen, I'll say what I've been saying for months, Andy. If the government can't repair the highways and build bridges and expand broadband, there's no point to having a government. And ultimately, I've expected that people will accept that and understand that. Not some of the progressive caucus are making statements like they'd be happy to tank the bill. That's their phrase for reasons that aren't clear to me. And, this other thing, the spending on human investments, human infrastructure, whatever Orwellian term is used, I'm not opposed to any of that. That's social spending. Infrastructure is what it is. You redefining it just adds to voter cynicism. You've got crumbling infrastructure. The Washington Post, which is not, a conservative newspaper, it published a comprehensive section on these, showing some of these projects, building levees to prevent storm damage, to fire prevention, roads, bridges, people who can't get from one neighborhood to another because a bridge has been closed for 15 years. These are projects that are badly needed. Everyone knows it. And in the end, you just hope that people come to their senses, even if some members of a party have to break from leadership. And I still am bullish on this, but we've learned, you can't just take for granted that these people on Capitol Hill will do what's right for the country. Maybe once upon a time you couldn't, but you can't necessarily assume that.
Double or nothing.
4 bottles of wine.
That the Democrats.
We're up to 4 bottles.
But they have to pass both bills.
No, I'm not going to go to the other bill. I don't call that, because see, I'm on record. I don't call that infrastructure. So, and I'm not criticizing it, but we can talk about it separately.
What difference does it make what it's called or even what's in the bill? Is it going to pass or not? That's the bet.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, I just want to, for the listeners' sake, just go back to process really quickly. The battle now, right, is that each wing of the Democratic Party is holding one of those 2 bills hostage.
Right.
So the left of the party says you can't pass the Manchin transportation bill unless we get Bernie's hearing aid benefits and elder care and free community college and the social spending bill. And the center is saying you can't hold this actual bill that we got 19 Republican senators to support that is 70% popularity with the American public for reasons that Carl just described hostage. So Nancy Pelosi, in a showdown a few weeks ago with the center, told these moderate Democrats, you can have a vote on September 27th on your infrastructure bill. And then Progressive said, no, only if that very day we do both together, remember, or you won't get us. The reporting is, while there are 100 members of the Progressive Caucus who are squawking that they're not going to vote for it, that if you do a standalone vote that day without the social spending, you could get in the teens of Republicans, and then maybe only a small enough number of the progressives actually oppose it, rebel, defy leadership, and that you could get the transportation package that Carl is talking about over the line. It would be a huge earthquake because they would be separating the bills after they said they were never going to be separated.
I can almost taste the Stag's Leap Cabernet as you're speaking, baby.
So, but then if the progressives managed, so if that happens, Carl is going to get his, I think, airplane brand wine that Tom is committed to spending on. But then I think that's the hope of everyone, right? The Chamber of Commerce, of the White House, that's everyone's secret hope from right to left, but they can't say it right now. So that's sort of September 27th. And then if that date passes without a standalone vote and they are going to be lumped together, that of course increases the chances that they end up with that.
Well, I think we have banned on this podcast the words human infrastructure. I think we've decided that is just too Orwellian for Real Clear Politics. But let's move on here. Carl, 20th anniversary, 9/11. What does this date mean to the country? What does it mean to you?
You know, for those of us who were in Washington or New York that day, or Pennsylvania, it's something you never forget. The greatest generation would remember for 50 years where they were when they heard about Pearl Harbor. And then the generation that came of age when John F. Kennedy was president remembered the searing news of his assassination. This was in that category, and it changed people's lives, and it changed how we felt. And if you lost people that day or in the wars that ensued, but I was a journalist, so I rushed to the White House thinking the safest place. Well, for all we know, it was the target of that plane, Pennsylvania, that was either going to the White House or the Capitol. The 9/11 Commission was never certain. But we're journalists, and we're thinking about this year is how the country's changed. The war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan has now ended badly. The war in Iraq, which a majority of Americans think was a mistake, sort of consumed George Bush's presidency and eroded a lot of the goodwill around the world that was directed towards Americans. And I think this is an uncertain time. We've had coronavirus kill 650,000 Americans. Our politics are even more partisan than they were then, more tribal. And I think it's a day where Americans, and I'm one of them, are uncertain about the direction of this country in a way, and in a way we haven't been in a long time. So it's a time for reflection.
So, AB, there was this interesting piece I saw in Vox this week by Zach Beauchamp. And he used this term, fortress liberalism, to describe what he believes is sort of the new consensus among Democrats, at least, or among liberals about foreign policy. He defined it this way. He said, liberal interventionism is being supplanted by a loose alternative that could be termed fortress liberalism, a belief that saving liberal democracy means defending it where it already exists, and that crusading wars for democracy and human rights are distractions at best and disasters at worst. Is this the legacy of 9/11 at this point, do you think, 20 years out, that now we've sort of turned some sort of corner and are looking inward?
Well, Andy, this is the interesting topic that we were reflecting on several weeks ago about where this moment with our withdrawal from Afghanistan takes us, about whether or not we're just going to be nationalists and take care of our own country, or we're going to be internationalists and retain the leadership role in the world we've had for, at least 7 decades, and what the post-World War II structure means for our national security future, whether we back down from that, water it down, abandon it entirely. The voters in both parties, the majority feels that we can't invest anymore in the world, that we're wasting our time, that alliances are for wimps, and that, Donald Trump at least told his voters that we are being laughed at and everyone thinks we're stupid and we look weak and we just have to put ourselves first. And so there's a debate that's still ongoing that we, had the four of us about what kind of investments do we have to retain or preserve in order to protect our own national security elsewhere, and what can keeping our alliances strong continue to bring us, not just the rest of the world. And I think that's a defining debate of our time. I don't know if it began on 9/11, but it's a real turning point for this country right now, whether or not we are going to look forward and say, we have to still play a role on the global stage and we can't retreat, or that's for the olden days. The reaction of the world to us after 9/11, we can all remember it. The four of us right now was extraordinary. And we thought those alliances and that loyalty and that cohesion was our strength. And now, what would happen now to Article 5 of NATO? So these are the big questions. And I think there are people in both parties that want to preserve liberal democracy and our role overseas. And there are people in both parties that don't. And I don't think it's a question for the Democrats. I think it's a question for members of both parties and people, those of us who are not in either party.
Let me just say Article 5 is the NATO rule that attack on one member of the alliance is an attack on all members of the alliance. So, Tom, what do you think? Here we are 20 years past 9/11. We're out of Afghanistan. Joe Biden explicitly, well, maybe explicitly is too strong, but he wanted to be out of Afghanistan to mark this anniversary. And he did it. He did it in a way that a lot of people thought was sloppy, to say the least. But, where are we right now and what happens next?
I think we are in a place where the country has come to reflect on the last 20 years and the actions that our government has taken and recognize that in many instances, they were the wrong decisions. I mean, the idea that, nation building has sort of fallen into disrepute. We have, I think, as you pointed out, I mean, I think it's now a majority view that we don't need to be crusading around the world trying to bring, modern democratic style governments to countries all over the globe. So that's where we are now. I mean, that could change. I mean, even the fortress democracy, that idea will run up against something like, the Chinese taking Taiwan or, something. And then what are we going to do? It certainly was a moment in time that was a hinge point in history. It changed everything. And I remember exactly where I was that day. I also remember, we had just started Real Clear Politics. We started it in 2000. So we were a very young company. I mean, at the point, it was just John McIntyre and myself, I think just the two of us. And I remember in the days after 9/11, I mean, people were so desperate for information about what had happened, not only the logistics of but what did this mean? Like, where did these people come from? Why did they mean us harm? What was the backstory to this outrageous attack? There was just an absolute desperate search for information, and it changed the way we did business at Real Clear Politics. That's when we went to 17 stories every day. Before that, prior to that, we'd only been running 5 or 6 or 10 or something, and it was a real hinge point for us as a company as well. And maybe 20 years from now we'll look back on it and it will have shifted again. Our perspective on 9/11 may have shifted again depending on what happens in the intervening time, but certainly, as we look back now on 20 years, as AB mentioned, Carl mentioned, a really patriotic and hopeful is not the right word, but unifying beginning, defiance. George Bush standing on that pile of rubble with that bullhorn saying the people who did this are going to hear from us soon, and being cheered by these firefighters that were covered in dust, to the members of Congress standing on the steps of the Capitol singing arm in arm, to the outpouring of support from all over the globe. It dissipated pretty quickly, and that's unfortunate. But I think, that initial beginning was a point of pride for us as Americans, in a time of real adversity.
Well, Carl, I'm going to let you have the last word. I will say one thing I remember was the flags. I had an office at that point right on Connecticut Avenue, right above DuPont Circle. And we put flags in our windows, and there was just American flags everywhere. But Carl, you wrote in your morning note this morning about music and 9/11. So tell us what your thoughts are on that, and then we'll end this podcast for today.
Well, yeah, both AB and Tom have alluded to the members of Congress linking arms and singing on the steps of the Capitol. But the great musicians of both sides of the Atlantic rose to the occasion as well. And Bruce Springsteen had this very evocative album, The Rising, which is the opposite of jingoistic. It's thoughtful about all the people, including the one song about wife or mother of a terrorist, others about firemen who didn't come home. Toby Keith had that in your face song about, we'll put a boot in your ass. It's the American way. Alan Jackson wrote a beautiful song, Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning, that was about empathy. I wrote about this, and you can go to our site and find story. I'm thinking today about the music of 9/11 in the pandemic era. And tonight, Willie Nelson will sing in New Hampshire. He's 88 years old, still touring. He's gonna sing tomorrow in Philadelphia, which is the cradle of liberty. It's where the Constitution and Declaration were presented to the Congress, and very fitting to me. But I found Carlos Santana is going to play in Asbury Park, where Bruce Springsteen made his bones and became who he is as a musician. And he's going to do a live concert, and there's going to be people there. And Carlos Santana said, and this I ended my piece, he said, he's talking about music. It's not a profession. It's not a job. It's not this or that. It's a way of life. It's a way of life where our spirit is able to elevate the listener to a place beyond fear. And that's where I think we need to go. And so that's where I'm thinking today. We need to go to a place beyond fear.
Thank you. I think that's a great place to end today. So I want to thank AB Stoddard, Tom Bevan, and Carl Cannon. We're usually here Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. So bookmark this podcast, check back often. And as always, and maybe especially this weekend, when we should all be remembering the Americans who lost their lives 20 years ago, I encourage you to go to Real Clear Politics, read one article from a writer or publication with whom you disagree. We continue to feature in this feed podcasts from Real Clear Defense on Afghanistan. Finally, we talked a bit about 9/11 and music, and that reminded me of a song written by Christy Jackson. It's called Little Did She Know She'd Kissed a Hero. I actually went to high school with Christy, who went on to become a very successful Nashville songwriter. The song has been covered a number of times, but I find her original version still the most affecting. So we'll leave you today with her singing her original version of this song. Let us know what you think. Thank you for listening, and until next time, for Real Clear Politics, I'm Andrew Walworth.
He found some socks. She chose his tie. And when he left for work that morning, he was just another guy going to work. He'd have to fly out to a meeting in LA, so she had kissed him twice goodbye. Little did she know she'd kissed her hero, though he'd always been one in her eyes. But when faced with certain death, he'd said a prayer and took a breath and led an army of true angels in the sky. Little did she know she'd kissed her hero, though he'd always been an angel in her eyes. Putting others first, it's true, that's what heroes always do. And now he doesn't need a pair of wings to fly. The phone had rung. His voice was calm. Before he could tell her anything, she knew something was wrong. I love you so. The last words he'd said. She said, I love you too. And then the phone went dead. Little did she know she'd kissed her hero, though he'd always been one in her eyes. But when faced with certain death, he'd said a prayer and took a breath and led an army of true angels in the sky. Little did she know she'd kissed her hero, though he'd always been an angel in her eyes. Putting others first, it's true, that's what heroes always do. And now he doesn't need a pair of wings to fly. Now he doesn't need a pair of wings to fly.